Уважаемые коллеги, уважаемые...
Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, we're beginning our session. Today we have an honorary report by Roberta Gatti, Investments into Human Capital. Before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to ask those who are sitting far away to make their way forward. There is lots of additional space, which will facilitate visibility of the presentation on screen. The subject today, the honorary report, is investments into human capital, or human capital matters. Roberta Gatti is a chief economist in the Human Development Practice Group. I'm not exactly sure how to translate it from English. I'm not sure how to translate Human Development Practice Group from English. Roberta has done her PhD thesis at Harvard, following which for many years she has been with the World Bank, authored many papers to do with economics, labor, family, poverty, the whole set of these important issues, and authored many various publications which are publications of the World Bank. So today we are very fortunate, and if we'd like to find out and share international experience and the latest research in the area of human capital, we are in the right place and we have the right speaker. But before I pass the word to Roberta, I would like to introduce our colleague who is sitting next to me, Mr. Horovay, Director of World Bank Russia. This is also a huge honor that you are visiting us at the High School of Economics.
And you have enough time, feel free, and we are happy to listen to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Gimpelso, for the kind introduction, and it is such a pleasure for me to be here and such an honor. So what I will talk about today is human capital, and specifically I'll try to talk about three things. The first one is I'll make a case that human capital matters. Maybe you don't need to be convinced, but we often feel that many ministers of finance, when they need to make a decision whether to invest or spend more in human capital, they need to be convinced. The second part is, of the talk will be to say that if I have convinced you that human capital matters, we still need to understand why individuals, families, and at times government fail to invest enough in human capital. And finally, we'll talk about measurement. And measurement is very important. It's kind of like the Cinderella of economics. It's something that you would like to have. When you have it, you love it, but it tends to be also underinvested in. And we more and more recognize the importance of measurement, and we recognize that you really manage what you measure. And so we hope that by scaling up measurement, we'll give tools to families, individuals, but also governments to understand how well to invest in human capital. But let me start from the very beginning. First things first. What is human capital? The definition that I put here is one that dates back to Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who in the 60s made very popular and by now fully accepted in economics definition of human capital. Human capital is something that includes education, training, medical care, and other additions to knowledge and health for individuals. And it even includes detractions to knowledge and health, like harmful addictions or smoking and drug use. This definition of human capital is one that economists warmed up naturally to, because it's very similar to a definition of physical capital. You invest in yourself in a way that is not that different from how you invest in physical capital. At the same time, it drew a lot of criticism. And I think that we all understand as individuals that there's much more to us as human beings than our human capital. There is an intrinsic value to education, an intrinsic value to health that for sure is not captured here. But let's go back to the basics of economics. And here the key intuition is the sort of similarity between human capital and physical capital. Now, let's go to the first part of what I would like to talk about, which is human capital matters. And it matters in three, actually four, and you'll see the fourth one a little later, key dimensions. It matters to us as individuals, and as I said, we shouldn't think about it very differently as we think about investing in physical capitals, computers, machines, cars. It matters at the aggregate level, and we know it matters for economies. And we often hear about how important it has been for many economies, Russia's, but particularly the economies in the Far East, that they have invested significantly in human capital and have made it to jump from low middle-income countries to almost high-income countries. Finally, human capital also matters for society, and there is an increasing body of evidence that shows that human capital matters for increased trust, for increased political participation and political awareness. So let's start with people. So what's the intuition behind investing in human capital? It's pretty simple, and we have all done it. So Gary Becker says, individuals decide to maximize a payoff function, and they invest in education or health to maximize their returns. So imagine an investment in schooling. You invest today for a payoff tomorrow. But the investment today is costly. And by the way, Gary Becker was not exactly the first one to come up with this idea. It actually dates back all the way to Adam Smith, who in The Wealth of Nations talks about these additions to individuals, which feels like wealth for individuals, but it doesn't come for free. And it doesn't come for free in two distinct ways. First, there are direct costs. Think about the tuition we've all paid for schooling. And second, there are indirect costs, opportunity costs. You go to university and you gain more schooling, but at the same time you forego work and earnings. So you do all this in the hope or expectation of payoffs tomorrow. And I decided not to put here a model, but to put here a few considerations. The first one, an important one, is that this is an intertemporal decision. I invest today for payoffs tomorrow. And in this intertemporality, many things come in between. Potential uncertainty, market frictions. And these are possible causes for why people invest too little. Let's say, for example, you don't know what are the returns to your education, and you might decide that they are too low, and so you don't invest enough. We'll get back to that later. The second one is that this decision is dynamic in a very intrinsic sense. And this is an example that has been popularized by another Nobel Prize winner in economics, Professor Heckman, who talks about dynamic efficiency and the concept of skills begets skills. So the idea is that what I invest today in myself not only gives some returns, but it affects the returns of how I invest tomorrow. And the typical example is investing in early childhood development and education. Children who arrive ready to school, ready to read, ready to understand the logic of math, they are much better able to grasp the material that is being taught, and so their returns to that material will be much higher. Thirdly, these returns can be individual. Think about a wage, that's an individual return, but they can also be social. And the typical example here is the one of the importance of educating women. If you educate women, when these women become mothers, they will be more attentive to their children's education, more attentive to their children's nutrition. There's a slew of evidence that show that you do not only educate a person, you educate a family, you educate the next generation. And finally, these benefits can be monetary, yes, wage, but can also be non-monetary. And I alluded earlier to the fact that there is now growing evidence that, for example, people with higher education are less likely to engage in crime. So park some of these thoughts in your mind because they might come in handy later. Now, that was the theory, but what about the numbers? So how did the economics profession came about to estimate returns to human capital? So here I put up the workhorse of microeconometricians, and the economists and the microeconomist among you will recognize it. It's called the Minserian regression. And this is basically a linear regression, log linear regression, that relates wages to individual education and to experience. So I think there have been 40 or 50 years of these regressions. They count in the thousands. So what's the summary evidence that we take home from that? A couple of points. First of all, on average in the world, 1 extra year of education has a return of about 10% higher earnings. So you and I, you have 1 year of education more than me, your salary is higher by 10%. Now, this is in the world over time. The variation around this 10% is huge. As a matter of fact, there are countries where 1 extra year of education is associated with 20% higher wages. This is, for example, Rwanda. And actually, the top 5 countries with, in terms of returns to education, are all in Africa. Rwanda, I think, is the very top. And from data from 2009, and I would be curious to hear your views on that, it actually turns out that Russia is a country with relatively low returns to education. So estimated from 2009, there were about 3.5%, fairly low in the worldwide landscape. So I'm curious to hear your views on that. If we think about it, how it happened how it went over time, actually, you see it here on the, let me see if I can point. Let me see. I'm a bit too scared of, oops, sorry. I was suitable, oh, okay, I did it, okay. Ta-da! Here we are, back where we were. So if we think about it over time, and you see it here on the right-hand panel, so how these average returns to education evolve? They actually went down a little, and you see them depicted in the blue line. And they went down in a way that is fairly specular and mirrors the increase in the average years of education. So the conclusion that I drew from this big picture, which is this picture, which is a sort of very big picture level, there are many conversations that we could have about that picture, is that as you increase the amount of a factor, so you have more years of education, the returns to that factor decrease. It's a very basic law of economics, marginal decreasing returns to a factor. I haven't talked about yet the graph that you see on the left, and that graph shows that there is a positive correlation between returns to education and returns to experience. So if you think about the wage, at least that's how Mincer thought about it, you can decompose it into big parts. One is how you arrive to the labor market with your education. That's your initial human capital. And then there is the human capital that you accumulate as you work. You're learning on the job. And that's what is captured with that experience. Basically, returns to education and returns to experience go in a factor of 3 to 1. So education pays off 3 times as much per year vis-a-vis experience. But they kind of go together. So this was just to give you a sense that human capital here in the form of education pays off. And these are some numbers that we all economists have in the back of our minds. Of course, there are many conversations around these methodologies econometrically, because one of the biggest problems of this estimation is that ability of individuals cannot be measured. And so this ability can be attributed and misattributed to either education or experience, when you could say it's just because, you know, some people are smarter than others. But the biggest problem related to this estimation, and this is not experimental. Actually, these regressions were run on, I think, 1,500 household surveys that have been accumulated over time with individual level records. So it's done on a large set of data, but it's non-experimental. The economists and the social scientists among you will be familiar, however, with the big development of impact evaluation and the many studies that have been conducted in the past 15, probably 20 years that try to get at the causal impact of investing more in human capital on measures of earnings or other measures. I will not go over all of them because we could be here for a week, but let me just present to you this graph and this evidence. So this graph is very famous, and this is the Heckman graph that shows one fact on which all economists agree. It's very important to invest early. And the earlier you invest in human capital, the higher the returns. And you see this intuition in the sort of downward sloping curve of that graph. The returns, which are on the y-axis, are the highest if you invest between prenatal and age 6 of children, and they go down. And to pay tribute to this large literature of impact evaluation, I just wanted to mention these results from a study that Heckman and his co-authors authored about last year that used the randomized evaluation of a very important experimental intervention in the United States, the CARE intervention in Carolina, which basically financed social workers, well-trained social workers, to work with disadvantaged families every week for about 2 years to help them with their parenting practices and finance the attendance of high-quality childcare for children. Bottom line, does human capital matter in that case? Big time. And 40 years in, Heckman and his co-authors went and measured the behavior and the earnings of these children, and they found that the internal rate of return of that intervention was 13% a year. So I challenge you to find an asset or a stock that gives a return of 13% a year. I definitely would invest my pension there if I could. And this was coming from basically a benefit to cost ratio, which was above 7. So benefits were 7 times the cost of that program. And just as an aside, Heckman went after not only monetary returns, earnings, but also the behavior of these children. And he found that for girls, the chances of risky behavior and teen pregnancy was dramatically reduced, and the chances of incarceration, which in the US is extraordinarily costly, was much, much lower, and this was working particularly for young men. So I wanted to leave you with the sense that if there's one thing among which microeconomists agree is that when you invest in human capital, please try to invest early. At the same time, I wanted to also reflect on the reality around us. And every time I travel to Europe, and I'm European myself, I am Italian, and particularly being here in Russia, I could not think about the other end of the spectrum of the life cycle, which is aging. So here we talked about investing early, but what about longevity? What's going on there, and how should we think about it in this context of investing in human capital? Well, the reality that we know for many of our countries is that many countries are getting older before they are getting rich. And this is thanks to the many advances in medical science that have allowed for this generation a significant extension of life expectancy before countries had become rich. So some countries had become rich and old. Think about Japan, think about Italy, but other countries are still catching up. So this creates a sense of mismatch between, and a challenge particularly for the current generation. I have to be frank, and whenever I hear people talking about aging as a challenge, what pops into my head is, think about the counterfactual of not aging. But getting past that, once we are faced with a large cohort of an age population, how should we think about it? First of all, I wanted to leave you with this fact, which is, I'll make it into a quip, but it was actually a bit sad for some countries. I admit, these are data from 2009, and I know that things have improved significantly in terms of mortality for Russia. But what this picture shows is that actually 57.8 is the new 60 for Russia. And at least it was so in 2009. And this is not a very good thing. So this picture shows what is the life expectancy, how old you should be now to have the same life expectancy that a 60-year-old had in 1959. And for France, 71 is the new 60 for men. But for a number of countries, less than 60 is the new 60. For Russia, it's 57.8. For Ukraine, it's 56.4. So in part, some of these gains in life expectancy have not materialized in a sort of uniform way across countries. In part, life expectancy is only part of the story. And what really matters in the end to sort of tackle this potential mismatch between who is around and the resources that we have to support them is that those years of survival of life expectancy are healthy. As a matter of fact, when we think about that from a fiscal point of view, what we find is that it's fundamental to actually maintain health and active aging. And this needs to be a collaboration across different policies. Health policies that would support sort of primary care and preventative care, employment policies that invest in people, in their training and the continuous renewal of their skills so that we can be productive for a longer period. And also demand-side policies that would help firms see the value of anyone who's not 30. And I count myself, sadly, among those. So there's a sense in which there's a whole literature, both academic and policy-wise, that is looking at the question of longevity from the point of view, what do we need to do now? Because this is a very pressing problem in Europe, but also increasingly in East Asia and in Latin America. So I wanted to conclude here the part where we talk about how much human capital matters for individuals. And I hope I convinced you that it does, particularly if we invest early. And to make a link with the aging agenda, the earlier we invest, the more chances we have to have workers who are able to renew their skills over the lifetime, because they really develop the brain plasticity that it takes to continue to be productive for a long, long period of time, facing a variety of conditions from the side of the production side. But if you remember one of my first slides, there's also an important story for how human capital matters for economies. And this might be the story that is more appealing to ministers of finance, who think in terms of how much I spend and how much I get back in terms of growth. So with this equation, I wanted to take you back to graduate school, or those who are in graduate school, keep you there for a moment, and just give a sense that in the past 50 years, there have been a variation of models of economic growth, but there's been a constant in that variation. There are basically 3 ingredients to foster growth. 3, not more. Investing in physical capital, machine, infrastructure, computers, car, transport. Invest in human capital, education and health. And invest in technology, new idea and better organization of our economies. That's all. So it kind of figures that human capital has an important seat at the table. It's 1 out of 3. And as a matter of fact, it's a little bit more. Because human capital matters for growth as it accumulates. And those of you who have looked at growth theory will remember the models of Solow that basically looks at the accumulation of factors. And human capital is a factor. It accumulates more people, people with better education, better instruction, more growth. And those are the exogenous growth model, just to sort of place it in your memory. The second one is that we said the third ingredient is technological progress. Where does technological progress come from, if not from our brains? So there's a sense in which human capital is the engine of innovation. And so that's the engine, and innovation is, in turn, the engine of long-term growth. And those of you who have studied growth theory will think about Paul Romer, who was until recently our chief economist of the World Bank, who has written important models explaining what is the fundamental role of ideas in development and in progress for countries. And finally, human capital matters because it interacts in some ways with computers. This sounds rather geeky, but it's actually one of the things that I see the most in conversations among economists these days. The idea behind it is that technological progress now is skill biased. That means that the returns to high skills tend to be very high, almost disproportionately. It takes much more sophistication, higher order cognitive skills to interact with computers, applications, to make progress and be a productive individual. At the same time, those skills are paid more. And that has an important implication for redistribution. And I could not leave that behind, particularly because I work for the World Bank. And for us, the goal of reducing, actually eliminating, eradicating poverty and supporting the growth of income at the bottom of the income distribution are the fundamental, are the lighthouse for all the work we do. So human capital matters, and it matters in different ways, and also for redistribution. Now, how does it work out in the numbers? Before we talked about the Minserian equation, the returns to education, how does it all add up? So in the literature, there have been two strands of work, a slew of cross-country regressions. Some of you might remember a paper written by Xavier Saleh-Martin, and the title was, I Just Run 2 Million Regressions. So those millions of regressions go in that first line, and they try to answer the question of how much will growth increase if I increase some human capital, some component of human capital. I will not go through the results of those 2 million regressions, but I will leave you with one thing on which economists agree by now. It's not schooling that matters, it's learning. And you see in the left-hand side of this slide, the nice line, the nice plot, we all love it when we get it, like nice fitted line that relates GDP per capita growth with test scores. And test scores are a measure of the quality of education. And on the right-hand side, you see that cloud, and we empirical economists get immediately very sad when we see a cloud like that, which relates instead annual growth per capita of GDP to years of schooling. So on the right-hand side, you have I stay in school. On the left-hand side, you have I learn in school. So that's one thing that has come clear from that literature. But the literature is also plagued by all sorts of econometrical problems. So many economists have gone a second route, which is the one of development accounting. And the question that they tried to answer with that literature was, if I see, let's say, if I compare US and Indonesia, and their per capita incomes are very different, what is it that accounts for those differences, and by how much? And for us, the question here is, how much does human capital account for in these differences across countries in income per capita? And the answer to the question is, it matters, and in the recent literature, it matters even more. So up to 10 years ago, human capital was estimated to account for about, on average, between 10 and 30% of differences in income between the US and Indonesia. More recent advances that have included the quality of human capital and also how low skills and high skills combine have brought it to be a large part, potentially even the majority, of the differences across income. So just a quick recap to make sure that I haven't lost you after lunch. We talked about human capital and how human capital matters. We talked about the model of Gary Becker that basically says we pay cost today for a return tomorrow. And we saw through wage regressions that on average, an extra year of education is worth it. And it's worth it of about the rate of 10% across the world. It's worth it a little bit less now than it was 30 years ago, but there's a very large distribution around that 10%. And I'm curious to know what you think of why returns are relatively low in Russia than they are in other countries, and whether we are just witnessing just the law of diminishing marginal returns, since Russia has been traditionally a country that has invested significantly in education and is one of the countries that is at the top in terms of number of years of education. Then we wondered, okay, that's for people, but how does it all matter in the aggregate? And so I tried to take you back to graduate school and think about growth models. Models where factors accumulate and models where there is a new and important role for human capital, which is the one of generating innovation and technology. And I gave you a quick summary of this literature that has tried to measure these effects. And the one thing that I would like you to take home that I'm sure you knew already, anyone who's a parent will definitely know that, is not the years of schooling that matter, but it's learning. And also the fact that recent advancing in development accounting have really got us to understand how important human capital is. And the answer to that is a lot. So something that I haven't talked about is non-money. I talked about money. I'm an economist. I talked about money. But these are things that have a correspondent in money, but matter for more than just the economy. And so there is an important counterpoint to the investment in human capital, which is living in better and fairer societies. And what you see here is just evidence that shows that more human capital is associated with less violent crime. You see the evidence that different aspects of human capital matters, and I'm referring to the evidence on social-emotional skills, the ability to manage conflict, the ability to work in teams, the ability to postpone pleasure and invest for the long run. And this is a very interesting intervention that was implemented with homeless men in Liberia. And finally, human capital builds social capital. It builds trust and it helps bringing people together. Now, you'll wonder, okay, fine, you talked about evidence of like 40 years ago. Mean serial regressions have been around since the 70s. So why should we talk about human capital now? And this is the last bit that I wanted to discuss with you under the heading of human capital matters, which has to do with what is happening now and what will happen likely with the future of work agenda. What you see here are two graphs from a very famous paper by David Autor and David Dorn. And what they find, and I guess the most famous graph is the one that you see on the left, they found hollowing in the middle. So they find that what has happened in the United States is that the jobs with middle routine skills have been wiped away. They're gone. And that's the sort of bottom of that sort of smile, which is actually not so much a smile for that part. And then there has been an increase in employment in either very low skilled professions. Think about, for example, personal care or family care. And there has been an increase in employment at the higher end of the skills. So this is what happens in a society when technological progress is skills bias, when technological progress can substitute routine professions and can instead complement, needs to be complemented by high skills. And these high skilled professionals then need to be complemented by people who help them with personal care, nannies, carers for older people, and all of those jobs, albeit low skills, that cannot be substituted by a machine. So why talking about human capital now? It is because it is what makes us human that will not make us substituted by a machine. And there's a way to invest in ourselves as human and to create the skills that will be needed to be productive, to be not substituted by a machine, and to continue to be flexible. And there's a whole agenda and conversation that we could have about how you learn to learn, how you can invest already early on for an agenda of lifelong learning. And then there's a whole conversation about how this is mattering in a differential way for developed countries, which are already seeing this hollowing out in the middle of skills, and developing countries that are not seeing it yet and where the urgency is probably still not yet felt, but all of these things are on the horizon. So I hope I convinced you that human capital matters. So if it matters so much, why are we talking about it? Why aren't individuals or government already just taking care of it? And this is where I just wanted to give you a sense that it also matters that we think about investing in human capital. For families, there are a slew of reasons why they might not be able to invest as much as they should in human capital. If I just look at my own personal or my own family returns, I might not invest as needed. There's a typical example of deworming, which seems to be the ideal example for this externality. If I give a deworming pill to my child, I take care of my child. But I might not think about the fact that deworming my child has an externality because it reduces the chance of other children to be sick, so I might give him too few pills. And that's a story of, I look at my private returns rather than social returns. In many societies, there are social norms that prevent families to, or inform decisions of family that are not optimal. And I'm thinking particularly about the role of girls in many societies. And poor families can just be financial constrained. When we talked about the model, we said we invest today for a payoff tomorrow. But if you don't have the money to invest today, that's it for you. And that's where an important agenda of equity of access and slacking the constraints of this family with conditional cash transfers, with scholarships, becomes very important. You don't want to miss the genius of the future just because that child had the misfortune of growing up in a family with no means. And finally, people might not have the right time horizon in their minds. And anyone who is the parent of a teenager will recognize this. It's like, I can't do this, no way. And they don't see that, working at a certain pace, with a certain focus, will have payoffs 2 years from now. What matters is going out with a friend tonight. So there are many reasons why individuals and family might not invest in human capital at the optimal amount, and that's why governments come in. And indeed they do. Education is traditionally publicly regulated and in many countries publicly provided, and so is public health. So if governments are there, why indeed bother again? Well, it's also because also governments fail for many reasons. Sometimes reforms in human development sectors are very political. Think about negotiations of wages or careers for teachers or for doctors, and the very uncomfortable conversation that you would need to have in a society to make a difference. And so sometimes these issues are not politically salient. We all know they are important, but they don't make it to the top. They're just too costly. They're too political suicides, so to speak. And then there's the very reality that it's just very difficult to deliver social services with quality. And this is where maybe politicians succeed, but bureaucracies might fail. And so that's why we're here to think about what can be done. And this is the question of, this is where measurement comes in. And this is where the World Bank is working increasingly, and hopefully with a multi-year program, to try to make a difference through measurement, among other things. So here, I'll talk about different angles to measurement. But the basic idea is that you manage what you measure. And for measurement, with measurement can come benchmarking, can come transparency, can come those conversations that might be uncomfortable for some, but that might be to the benefit of many. And there's nothing like putting out there numbers that hopefully are trusted and well gathered to actually get those conversations going. So there are different angles that the institution has taken and that will be taking. The first one is the changing wealth of nations. Some of you might be familiar with this report, which was just launched about a month ago, and that's a report that basically takes the angle of sustainability. And that's a very important one. We are here making decisions today, but this decision have repercussions for the future. And in a very intuitive sense, GDP is a flow measure that gives us a return, a yearly return to what we do. But wealth is the asset. And I think it was just Stiglitz who said, well, whenever you assess a company, you don't just look at their yearly income, you look at their assets. So this is an attempt of measuring assets for countries and their wealth. It is done by from the bottom up, and so summing up estimates of produced capital, those are the machines, you know, that K that we put in that production function, natural capital, which is very important for many countries, oil resources and energy and forestry, and for the first time, also human capital. And I wanted to leave you with just a few factoids here of what we find. First of all, how human capital is calculated. This is simply the expected value of earnings for all individuals living in a country. That's the wealth. My wealth is the stream of my salaries from when I started to work until I will retire. And what do they find in this report? Well, they find massive inequalities. Not that we didn't know it, but per capita wealth in high-income countries is 52 times that of low-income countries. 52 is a big number. It's a big multiplier. So that was a first big piece of evidence. The second one is that, ta-da, human capital is the largest component in countries' wealth. Although this is not true for all country groupings, but on average, human capital is the largest component of countries' wealth. And the differences that you see is that in low-income countries, natural capital takes the lion's share. But in high-income countries, and as you move up in the income spectrum, human capital becomes more and more important. So although we cannot draw causal implications from this statement, we can't say it is because of human capital that countries have become rich. That will take a sort of research program for, I think, decades. I don't think anyone has cracked that question fully. It is quite a suggestive evidence. Now, so that was a sort of conversation around measurement, wealth, and sustainability. But how can we use measurement to change reality? How can you use measurement to change the conversation around human capital? This is what our president, Jim Kim, is trying to do with his human capital project. So he asked us, and we're all working around this, so this is just forthcoming. I'm not talking about results. I'm talking about an ongoing work, and I also look forward to hear your views and your thoughts of a program that will have at least three components, of which two have to do with measurement. The first one, a metric that will be used to measure human capital of the next generation and eventually also provide a ranking of countries. And the second one, an initiative that will be of stepping up measurement to do various things. Increase the set of outcomes, important outcomes that are measured, understand what we don't know yet, and also identify what are effective policy levers to change reality. So instead of showing you an index, I can show you the principles that we're going by, and we're trying to square a circle. But it will be an index that looks at outcomes rather than inputs, because it's outcomes that count. It will be an index that will be broadly available for many countries, so you need to be fed into with ingredients that are available for many countries. We're trying to do something that is simple and also gives saliency to the question of human capital and to some fundamental elements of human capital. As I said, one of the things that we all economists agree is that it's important and very productive to invest early. So there is a sense that we're going to be looking at the next generation of workers, and they're going to be focusing particularly, but not solely, on the early part of life. And finally, and this is a bit more of a sort of second-order comment, but there are indices out there. The World Economic Forum Index, the Human Development Index from the UNDP, so there's already a lot of measurement. And one of the things that we wanted to do is to really think about an aggregations of different attributes of human capital that could be meaningful from an economist point of view, and that could actually be an item of conversation with ministers of finance. I guess we're all a bit obsessed with making an impression on ministers of finance. So this is what we are working on, and I don't have yet results to show you, but I welcome your views. The second part that we're trying to work on is what I indicated here as component 2, which is a program of scaling up measurement. Some of the measurement that needs to be scaled up is simply just international assessments of schooling. Russia is lucky, and Russia is a country that does tremendously well in this assessment. Is a leader in PIRLS, is doing at the average of OECD in PISA, but there are a number of countries that do not even have a single international assessment in the past 20 years. And these countries lack a tool that would allow them to sort of benchmark and compare themselves to countries in similar conditions and try to figure out what are the specific areas where they would need to work on. So that would be like an easy win to do, to expand that set of measurement. But I was talking about measurement as also a way for us to learn what we don't know yet. And if we know that it's important to invest early, in early childhood, we still have not figured out what are the mechanisms through which we can do that effectively and efficiently. So one of the initiatives that we are trying to develop is working with countries and international organizations to have a comprehensive measure of skills of children in the 3 to 6 range, both school readiness but also social-emotional skills that could be connected to both the home environment, the time investment of parents, and also to the environment that they face when they go to preschool. We call this MELCO. We need to find a better acronym. You know that the World Bank is alphabet soup sometimes, and we have tons of acronyms. This one is not, I don't like it very much, so if you have better ideas, please. We'll have various domains to measure pre-numeracy, pre-literacy for 3 to 6 kids, social-emotional skills like self-control, ability to manage conflict, executive functioning, so all the organizational skills, fine motors, and also measures of health. And as you know, I'm sure there is a particularly strong interaction between health and nutrition and cognitive development in the early years. So all of these matter, and they matter together. There have been already quite a few pilots of this type of measurement, and what we are discussing now is how successfully they predict outcomes later on. And this is what essentially one would want to be after, a good measure that is predictive of things that will happen later. Let me also talk about this last part, which is called STEP. I thought this acronym was a bit more appealing. And these are similar surveys that instead of being applied to the 3 to 6 age range, they apply to the whole working age population, 15 to 64. They are the corresponding of the PIAC initiative. I'm sure that you've heard of it, which is the sort of working age population companion of PISA. PIAC is being implemented in OECD countries, and STEP is being implemented in developing countries with a very similar questionnaire. And what we do is that we test directly numeracy and reading skills and comprehension for adults, but also try to measure their social-emotional skills to see how these skills carry over after the school period. And finally, we talked about measuring outcomes and figuring out what goes on. But how do we change outcomes? And remember what I tried to say, you know, in all honesty, it's very difficult to deliver social services with quality. And there are potentially, there's a chain of levers that could be used. We are now focusing on a few ones. And these are surveys that we have implemented in Africa and East Asia, and modification of these surveys to be adapted to higher income countries will also be implemented in the future. These are surveys that look whether teachers show up, whether they know their materials, and connect these measures directly to outcomes for children. Similarly, in health facilities and hospitals, we look at whether doctors and nurses show up, how much they know of the material that they ought to know, and we measure that with vignettes of a sort of staged interaction between the doctor and a patient along a variety of protocols of diseases. And what we find, and this is data from Africa, well, first, that it matters. So if a teacher shows up, it's important. You see the teacher's absence is associated with lower learning of children. If the teacher knows its content, that matters. If the teacher knows how to teach that content, it matters. So we're basically potentially on the right track of measuring the right policy levels. But what we find, I put these slides back here, apologies. What we find in reality is that if those levers matter, the measurement of those policy levers is quite abysmal. So we find that in Uganda, 47% of health professionals do not show up regularly for their job. And we find that in Madagascar, 42% of teachers, in Tanzania, 47%, in Mozambique, 56%, in Uganda, 57% do not show up for work. So it's very difficult to learn from a teacher who's not there. And so these data, as astonishing as they are, they were astonishing to the politicians, to the trade unions, to the parents themselves. Well, to the parents less, they knew that the teachers were not showing up. But at the high level, they were a game changer in the countries where these data have been released. So in conclusion, this agenda of measurement is one to which we are giving a much higher profile now at the same level as a policy conversation, because it's an important precondition for a meaningful and potentially uncomfortable but important conversation around investing in human capital. I hope that in this talk I convinced you that human capital matters. It matters for people, it matters for economies, and in the future it will matter in a way that will have returns that can be very unequal across the population because of the nature of the technological progress that we see. Notwithstanding all these returns to human capital, both individuals and families and governments might fail to invest as much as needed in human capital. Human capital tends to be less visible than bridges. And so it might be more difficult for politicians to buy into the agenda. An agenda that, since it involves many people and different systems, can also be fraught with political traps. So we hope that measuring more and better is a way of injecting a sensible common platform for uncomfortable, but we hope productive conversations to happen around human capital. So thank you for your attention, and I'm here for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. You covered so many issues, and you definitely convinced us that the human capital matters. Probably we had some doubts.
We can all go home now.
But now they disappeared. Yeah. Before asking the audience to raise questions, probably we have to answer the question you raised to us. Why return to human capital is so low in Russia? Of course, to answer this question, probably we have to look and to compare measurement you used, data you are using, and the data we are using. Our story is a little bit different. Our story is that in early 90s, the return to human capital, if we use standard Menselian framework, was very low. But then it went up, and it peaked at around 9-10% somewhere by the end of the first decade in this century. After that, there was some decline. And if I'm right, the return is now somewhere around 7 or 8%. Anna Lukyanova is here. She did quite a lot of work on that, and she can probably add or correct what I'm saying. But the story is that Russia reached 10% or was very close to 10% return. But after that, you are right, there was some decline, but at the same time, tertiary education became a kind of social norm, and Russia is probably among world leaders in terms of fraction of employed population having tertiary education. If we exclude short cycle tertiary education, tertiary B, of course the fraction will be lower, but anyway 1/3 or even a little bit more of employed population would have that. And that's very simply the story as I see it. You have much lower. I remember there was a paper by a few colleagues from the World Bank, including Ruslan Yemtsov. They said that it was lower. I don't know whether you refer to this paper or there is something new, but there is some difference. That's my answer. Now, please ask questions. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Pavel Sorokin.
Pavel Sorokin, Institute of Education, Higher School in Economics.
Presentation is very, very important for what we do here in High School of Economics. I have a very small question. Considering the theoretical side of your paper, what are the grand theories, beside the theory of Harry Becker, you think are applicable to picture the image of human actor, of human being in the current world? Because as far as I can see from your presentation, you go a little bit further than traditional writing on human capital from 60s. This soft skills issue, this unpredictability, this lifelong learning, being able to change all the time. So what are the grand theoretical perspectives applicable to this case aside from Harry Becker? Thank you.
And can I add to this question? Absolutely. What do you think about the book of Brian Kaplan, The Case Against Education?
I thought I convinced you.
No, I'm just asking.
Okay, so these are very good questions. So I think that the Becker framework can be applied very broadly. The question is, what is the argument of the investment? In the recent literature, and I think this was really Heckman who brought the attention to the soft skills, so it's something like 15 years plus or 10 years plus, the question of soft skills has become very important. And I didn't have time to talk about it in the presentation, but we talk about learning, but what the learning that we measure is really cognitive learning. And the part that employers continuously say is increasingly important is how you work with teams, how you manage conflict, and so on. I think this is not, I think this goes back to the why now type of question, because as the world of production becomes much more complex, it can less be parcelized in independent, simple units. Then working together becomes fundamental. But then working together becomes a combination of cognitive and soft skills. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to use investing in soft skills and to use a Becker model to think about, I invest in developing these skills, and the family invests in developing these skills. I think that where we need to, as a sort of community of thinkers, to overcome a little bit of resistance is that many think that these skills are innate. You are born a sort of collaborator, or you are born somebody who works in solitary. But actually the evidence is that these skills are very malleable. And this is the very evidence that Heckman and his co-authors have put forth, that through these investments, particularly for disadvantaged children, these are the children who are more at risk for higher cost of not having these skills, incarceration and crime, and these are the children who have a more limiting home environment. And so the skills are malleable. We need to measure them better. And something that I should have said is that I think we know better how to measure these skills in the 3 to 6 range. But there's evidence now that measuring these social-emotional skills in the working age population is a very, very difficult endeavor. And there is a recent paper that looks at the STEPS /PIAC that finds that the measurement there is basically not correlated with much of what we want it to be correlated with. And so it's not that these skills don't matter. We know that they matter, but we still don't know how to measure them well. So in short, I would say, I think we can use that simple framework. We need to change the argument, and we need to change the argument now because the reality of production has changed dramatically and makes other elements of skills as important or equally important going forward. I think I'm not going to talk about the case against education. However, I didn't want to convey with my talk the sense that we should just pour money into social sectors. This was not the point that I wanted to make. As a matter of fact, it's probably for many countries the most important thing is to spend that money well rather than spending more. Spend more of that. There is also a question of spending and designing interventions in a way that are coordinated with the productive texture around it. So human capital does not operate in isolation. And some of these estimates that we saw are the result not only of investment in human capital and education, but also of the institutions that are around them. As a matter of fact, in the Changing Wealth of Nations, those estimates of human capital wealth are probably a combo of those. And the returns, so one potential explanation around the returns of education is that it's not just about the quality of what children and young people learn, but it's about how they can use them in the world around them. And that has to do with the organization of society, with the efficiency of management, and so on. So thank you for bringing up the question of nuances around the message, because they're very important.
Thank you very much. More questions? Yeah? Martin, please.
Hi, I'm Martin Carnoy from Stanford. It's quite a menu you've given us, but if I can cut through your main premises are that to a large extent, low-income people are underinvesting in their education because they don't have the right values. Second, government doesn't invest enough in education because they don't have enough information. Particularly, they don't invest enough in low-income students because they don't have this kind of information, which once provided, they will then start investing heavily in better teaching, low-income kids, preschool education, soft skills for low-income kids. So I'd like to remind you that we've known about human capital since the late 50s. These same measurements were done at that time at the University of Chicago, showing that, in fact, a very high fraction of the wealth of nations is in human capital, particularly in the developed countries. And we've had tons of information about all of these things for at least 30 or 40 years, even international tests showing that some nations do better than others. And yet, I don't see this massive move in countries to invest heavily in the health and education of low-income kids. Even in the United States, we have a tremendous deficit in the investment in low-income kids, and we have all the information we need. We don't provide free public child care and early childhood education, despite the fact that Heckman has been telling us, and other people have been saying it for years. So is it because government doesn't have the information, and that if you provide it to them, all of a sudden they're going to invest heavily in teacher skills and in low-income kids? I just don't believe it, because I live in a country that doesn't do it. And despite the fact that we have plenty of information and have had it for years, thanks in partly to international agencies like the World Bank that are measuring this stuff. And I appreciate that you're doing it. I think it's a good thing. But I think the premise that it's simply, information does play a role. I don't want to say that it doesn't. Information for low-income kids does play a role. We know that. But the idea that somehow you're going to solve the inequality problem, particularly wealth inequality, by providing information to governments and to low-income people, I think is really naive. Thank you.
I've been called a romantic before, so I take that as a compliment. So first of all, thank you for your point, which is very important. A couple of clarifications, and then a little bit more on what I could pompously call the theory of change behind this conversation. So you suggested, that my main premise was that low-income people don't have the right values, and government. A premise. So I actually haven't even talked about values, and this is an important, separate, and complementary conversation about aspirations. What I mentioned is that low-income people don't have enough money sometimes, and so that could be a barrier. In theory, we know that that's true. Practically, what is the share of children who do not attend, for example, higher education because of financial constraints? I think that the recent work of Caroline Oxby shows that we're still missing out. I mean the U.S., still missing out a large share of gifted but disadvantaged children. I think you make the right point that some countries have known that human capital matters for the longest time, and there's no movement around changing things. I mean, we all know that there are societal values around which polities vote and live by. And there's massive differences between the US and Europe in terms of redistribution preferences. And it could all be that. When we look at the developing world, however, we find that many of the constraints might be simply technical. So we find, if you look at the evidence from the World Management Survey, you find also a dramatic variation in management quality, also of schools and health systems. So it could be that some things are not delivered with quality just because technically some countries or some bureaucracies are not there yet. The more sophisticated explanation is probably that some bureaucracies do not deliver well because they don't want to deliver well. And that's where we hope that putting out data and engendering these conversations around what doesn't work could help. In some countries it did. Like Germany had a PISA shock the first time that they implemented PISA, and they did something about it.
What did they do?
I think that they improved they reformed curricula, they improved curricula. You could say reforms do nothing, and I could also agree with you. In Pakistan, in the past 10 years, we counted 100 different reforms about education, and the outcomes did not budge an inch. So it's not that even the politicians who pick up the issues, they might not be able to make a difference because the bureaucracies are not aligned with what the politicians want. So the problem is very complex, and I hope I didn't give the impression that this is the solution to everything.
I understand that there are not many things you can do as an international agency. I understand it. But I think I just want to urge you to be careful about saying that more information is the solution. Just be careful about that, because you could be in the danger of playing a role of actually giving the excuse to people not to do anything because they're just gathering information.
That is a very good point. And as you clarified before, I also didn't say it's the solution, but it's a solution. The World Bank does much more than putting out information. It works with governments to diagnose within countries things that happen, lends money to support reforms, works to improve the technical capacity of organizations, and so on. Measurement is a way to also empower other parts of society to come around it. If something happens around this, and if measurement just changes something, I think it would be a great success, and I would be super happy. But I'm completely aware that excuse could be multiple to not do anything. And even when countries do stuff, it might not even matter. And the example of Pakistan is one that we always bring to sort of remind ourselves, 100 reforms, no change in outcomes. But you made a very good point. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Oh, yeah, sure.
So just to add, I mean, it's fairly obvious that the investment in human capital is a long-term investment. So it is by definition does not coincide with the political cycle. So you have governments who may see that there's a need to invest in human capital, but finance ministers, when they are given choices where to spend and where to cut, they may go to places like health, education, and social protection. And this is what you see country after country, especially when those countries go into crisis situations. This is precisely what happened in Russia in 2014-15. And that's where the cuts took place. And now there is a rebound. I think the realization is there. I think the desire is there to spend more. The other point is on the equity side. I mean, these are the people who are least able to influence policies. I mean, let's be realistic. I mean, those are the people with low incomes. Their ability to to have their voice heard is the lowest. So they themselves have difficulty acquiring these rights to have appropriate access to education. And where Russia is doing very well on PISA and has been increasingly doing well in the last 6 years. You look at the 2 or 3 last PISA results, especially on reading and math, not so much on science. But here too is an issue of equity. And there's a big difference between different groups of society and their children, how they fare in terms of outcomes.
Thank you. More question? Please, a microphone, and please introduce yourself. No, green button.
This is okay. Thank you very much. Tamas Ibalizada from Azerbaijan State University of Economics. My question is about technological development and correlation between technological development and human capital development, because in the second half of the 20th century we see that the countries that pursue technological development they also realize the high level of human development. How do you see after the fourth industrial revolution? I mean, during the revolution, of fourth industrial revolution, and what can you say correlation between technological development and human capital development in the countries, even both in the advanced countries, also in developing countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is a very, very good question. So there is an international space now for technological development. And so there are some countries that are leading, or some groups or agglomerations that are leading technological development. And then there is a lot of what we call technological development has less to do with a sort of invention and much more to do with adaptation. So there's a sense in which you would want to promote the ability to be innovative and entrepreneurial, but you also want to develop a sort of, I wouldn't call it cadre, but like a sufficient critical mass of people who have the cognitive abilities to adapt innovations that are produced somewhere else. I was just thinking of a recent paper that I saw on probably the first one that I saw in the literature linking patents to third grade school records of people. So Raj Chetty and John Van Reenen have this new paper on the NBER series where they put together patent records, tax records, and school records for the state of New York. And they find like an interesting correlation. They find that being exposed to innovation early on as a child, so growing up in an area where there were more innovators, the higher density of patents affects causally your ability to be an innovator. So in a way, for sure there are correlations. All good things go together. So you would think technological development and human capital, they are correlated, but this also probably happens in countries that have good institutions that enable both having high returns to human capital, so you invest in that, and also a good regulatory environment for technology. So it could all be spurious to the quality of institutions. There is probably a causal link between innovative capacity and how you were trained at school as a child. And actually, Van Reenen and others find it that for boys, it was particularly important to be high scoring in STEM at grade 3, and that was a strong predictor of being an innovator. But I would be careful in drawing causal inferences from what we see as correlations, because they might all be coming together from the quality of institutions in countries.
More questions? We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Please. Зеленая кнопка.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. Could you please point out more clearly the differences between the human capital index that you described and the well-known human development index, because it has almost the same ingredients, I mean education and health, and it measured not actual living standards, but now it measures capabilities, so we could also consider it as the possibilities for future generations. So why do we need another measure of the same things? Thank you very much.
That's a very good point. The Human Development Index is, I think, a geometric average of GDP, life expectancy, and future years of schooling. It's an index that is used, although it has been criticized by economists under many aspects. One specific one is that there's no logical construct to putting together these three things that belong to different domains: income, life expectancy, and schooling. I think that the index that the World Bank is producing is more as a toy tool for advocacy. And as we are going after a tool for advocacy, something that would elevate the conversation around investing in human capital and investing for all, particularly with these considerations about equity, we're looking for something that we can aggregate meaningfully and that tries to capture some of the key elements of developing human capital. At the moment, we're thinking about survival up to age 5. And although survival up to age 5 is almost universal in middle to high income countries, in a country like Chad, when you're born, you have 85 chances to over 100 to survive. Then we're thinking about quality of schooling, so to focus on learning rather than years of schooling. And then we're trying to think about what is the independent effect of health on productivity that is not channeled through learning. And for that, we are looking at various indicator measures, because we kind of came to the conclusion that there isn't a widely accepted summary measure of the health status for individuals that would be available for a large set of countries. So that's what we're doing. We have a focus specifically on productivity. We try to aggregate it based on aggregate these different ingredients based on standard growth theory and on how it has been implemented for development accounting. Why we're doing it is because there is need to invest more and better in human capital, not across the board for all countries, but for some countries that's the case, and particularly for some segments of the population. And it's good to have this conversation now, because the world is changing in a way that will make human capital more and more important.
Thank you. And probably being a chair, I want to use the privilege and to ask you also one question. When we look at PIAC data, we see that the major components of skills, literacy, numeracy, and problem solving, they peak very early, and then they decline over age. When we look at age wage profiles, we see that in OECD countries, wages go up or remain flat but don't decline until pension age. How to explain the gap? Is there latent human capital we don't measure, or some institutional agency issues a la Lazier, or something else?
I will go for all of the above. For sure, there is something latent, and the evidence on how skills develop over the life cycle is that as we age, we become worse mathematicians, but we become better managers. And so it could be that as we age and we move from being, I personally just can give you the example, I moved from running regression myself to managing teams that do research work, but that I can still supervise. What is being paid is the return to that ability to manage that we know increases with age, and that is not captured, is latent to the cognitive measures. It's also probably true that there are institutions in labor markets that have a payoff for the insiders. And, you know, with age, you become the ultimate insider. We know that the wage premium goes up with age, and whether that's fair, that's a different question.
So thank you very much. I think it's time for us to finish our session, and it's time to us to thank Roberta Gatti once again for her very interesting and very useful for all of us presentation.
Thank you.